Good afternoon, and welcome to the Plenary panel for Creating Change. My name is Erica Nagel. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Deputy Director of the New Jersey Theater Alliance. We have an incredible panel with us today, moderated by Professor Elise Body, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. First, I want to offer just a little bit of context about why we've included this panel in our programming. As the event steering committee designed the structure for Creating Change, we kept returning to the idea that we can't move forward without understanding and acknowledging the past. We also felt that sometimes those of us who live in New Jersey can have a misperception that our state is exempt from the more pernicious threads of history, such as enslavement, redlining, the genocide of Indigenous people, police violence, and other injustices. We wanted to convene this panel to ensure that this gathering, while focused on the arts community, was contextualized by history, policy, and the current work happening outside of the arts to move our entire state to a more equitable and just present and future. It's my great pleasure and honor to turn things over in just a moment to Professor Elise Body, who will moderate the conversation. Professor Body is a professor of law, Henry Rutgers professor, and Judge Robert L. Carter Scholar at Rutgers Law School. Her scholarship explores the regulation of race in spatial contexts and dynamic systems that perpetuate racial inequality. In 2021, she was named the founding Newark director of Rutgers University's Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. As the founder and director of the Inclusion Project at Rutgers Law School, she's engaged with communities, students, faith leaders, educators, and researchers in a multi-sector initiative to build equitable education systems in New Jersey public schools. Before joining the Rutgers faculty, Dr. Body was the director of litigation for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Her commentary has appeared multiple times in the New York Times and the Washington Post, among many other news outlets. And she's appeared on ABC News, MSNBC, NBC Nightly News, and National Public Radio, among other television and radio programs. I definitely encourage you to read her full and extremely impressive bio on the Creating Change event site. Please join me in welcoming Professor Body and this amazing panel of guests.
Thank you, Erica. I'll just note that you also gave me a promotion because I don't have my PhD, but thank you for your generous introduction. I'm really delighted to be a part of this panel, and I want to thank the organizers of this event for allowing me to participate and to moderate a conversation among this very distinguished group. The difficulty of having such an illustrious panel is that they have very extensive bios, so I'm just going to read a few top line points so that you get a sense of who they are, and then we'll open up the conversation. So in alphabetical order, we'll start with Andrea Mcchristian, who is the Law and Policy Director at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, where she leads the implementation of the strategic vision and the direction of the law and policy program. Ms. Mcchristian oversees the programmatic function of the Institute's three pillars of social justice, democracy and justice, economic justice, and criminal justice reform. Before becoming the law and policy director, she served as the director of the Criminal Justice Reform Initiative and was the primary author of a really terrific report I'm editorializing there, called Bring Our Children Home, Ain't I a Child, which is the basis of the 150 Years is Enough campaign. Her writing on juvenile justice and racial justice has been published in the Star Ledger, as well as the Juvenile Justice Information Exchange and New Jersey Spotlight. Next is the Reverend Dr. John Norwood, who is a citizen of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, which he served as the principal justice of the Tribal Supreme Court, as a councilman, and as the senior minister to the Nanticoke Tribal Christian Prayer Circle Ministry. Dr. Norwood regularly represents his tribe at the national and international level. He is the co-chair of the Task Force on Federal Acknowledgement of the National Congress of American Indians and the General Secretary of the Alliance of Colonial Era Tribes. Since 1992, he has served as the senior pastor of the Ujima Village Christian Church of Ewing, New Jersey, and is also the founder and director of the Christian Mission School of Theology. He is a tribal historian, cultural presenter, writer, drummer, and craftsman. His tribal craft work has been exhibited in museums and at art festivals. He has represented his tribe, again, at the national and international level, and has lectured at various academic institutions. Next is Lindsey Roberts. Ms. Roberts is a New York City-based performing arts professional and New Jersey resident. She is deeply rooted as a well-known stage actress, educator, and arts management consultant. On stage, she has made her Broadway national tour debut in the Tony Award-winning musical Memphis, covering the starring role of Felicia Farrell. She has also been seen in Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, After Midnight, and many New York City and regional productions. She has been widely recognized for her work, and her voice can be heard on over a dozen cast albums, film and television projects, and national commercials. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Deborah Gray-White, who is the Board of Governors Professor of History and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. She has not only been a teacher, but the co-director of the Black Atlantic Race, Nation, and Gender Project at the Rutgers Center for Historical Analysis, and chaired the history department at Rutgers. Dr. White is the author of Ain't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South. She has many other publications: Let My People Go, African Americans, 1804 to 1860, published by Oxford University Press, and Too Heavy a Load, Black Women in Defense of Themselves. She has received a number of very prestigious fellowships, and is just a well-known and recognized historian. So please join me in doing a virtual welcome to our wonderful panelists. And with that, we'll get started. I thought I would begin by sort of situating us in this moment. We've just had a verdict against Derek Chauvin, whom we all know is the Minneapolis police officer who was found guilty of murdering George Floyd. And I wanted to start by, given the very recent nature of this event, how are you all processing this moment? Could you offer us some thoughts on sort of how you're thinking about where we are as a country on this issue of policing?
Well, as a historian, maybe I should start off. I just think I think we're at a moment of beginning, and that is sort of in terms of how I'm processing it. It just seems like we've been here before. We've seen such violence done to Black bodies, and we've protested over and over and over again, and it always seems like, okay, something is going to happen. I think that at this point, what we need to do is do what Maxine Waters said. We need to keep up the pressure. We need to keep up confrontation, because it is only when Black people pressure, it's only when we decide no more, this is enough, and we ask for change. This is just the beginning. There's so much that still has to be done as far as law enforcement is concerned, as far as Black education is concerned, as far as Black health is concerned. We're in the middle of a pandemic where Black people have suffered so much more than other groups in America. So I'm really pleased that the verdict came in guilty, and that, yes, I can believe my own eyes, but I'm skeptical that this is going to lead to much more. It will and it can, if I think we keep the pressure up.
Just quickly to build on that, and again, anyone else jump in, but one quick observation. I've some folks, and I guess I include myself in this as well, are joyful about this verdict. If it had gone the other way, it's hard to imagine what that might have unleashed around the country, just in terms of the pain and trauma that people are already experiencing in this country, from his murder to the pandemic to you know, the last president that we had in office. We're just in such a traumatic, very raw period of time. And there's also this sense that, you know, so is this what it takes to convict a police officer, that we have to have a videotape of a man literally being murdered right in front of our eyes? You know, and Andrea, maybe I can turn to Ms. Mcchristian, maybe I can turn to you for your thoughts on that, because you do a lot of work around criminal justice. Is this what we're talking about, that we have to have, you know, we have to have videotaped proof before we can expect that a police officer will be convicted? And as we know, we have since seen other killings of Black people, Black and brown people, just within the last week. So just what are your thoughts?
Sure. Thanks so much, Professor Boddy, and thank you so much to the New Jersey Theater Alliance for the invitation to be here. I think for me, it really did kind of speak to what you're talking about, Professor, because I feel like I let out a deep breath that I didn't even know I had. And even as an attorney who understands kind of the system and the law, it was still shocking to see accountability here. But I think for me, and kind of to echo a bit of what Professor White was talking about, it wasn't enough for me. It feels like even as I let out the breath, it just simply wasn't enough, because real justice would mean that George Floyd would still be alive today and able to flourish with his family. And I feel like real justice, looking even more abstractly, will come when Black people no longer have to sit their children down at the kitchen table and have to talk with them about what you can and cannot do in the eyes of police to make it home alive. And I feel like real justice will come when Black people we can be given the space to be imperfect without that equating to a death sentence. And that makes me think of the deaths we're still processing of Adam Toledo and Ma'Khia Bryant, teenagers who maybe were imperfect, but still should not have had their imperfect nature result in death. And I think that speaks to real justice really coming when we have accountability imported into every part of policing, but even more importantly, us looking outside of policing to what resources and investments communities need to feel safe, to have the resources they need, so law enforcement isn't called as the default, but only as the very last option, so we can diminish the footprint of policing. And I think kind of looking towards that moment where the conversation doesn't begin and end with policing, but rather what do communities need to feel safe, will really be the transformation that we need to see as a society.
Dr. Norwood and Ms. Roberts, I wasn't intending to call on folks, but you know, if I have to go there.
No, I'm happy to jump in, and thank you so much for having me here today. I really, I resonate with what you just said, Ms. Andrea, about the breath. I think as an artist, as a performing artist, so much of the work is reliant on the breath. And just as I felt a deep exhalation when we heard the verdict, immediately within 15 minutes, I was knocked breathless again when we heard about not just a Black and brown body, but a Black and brown child, truly, of Ma'Khia Bryant. So much of the work that I do off stage is rooted in arts education. It's my passion. It is as important to me, if not more important than the work that I do on stage. And so thinking about accountability and thinking about community for a 16-year-old child, I think, what about her peers going back to school after this? I think about what that means for the students who are watching this unfold, who are the culture keepers documenting this, right? In the George Floyd case. What does it mean when we look at her work as a historian, as a photographer, the artistry used to capture and to bring us to that verdict? And so as an arts administrator and arts education, my heart breaks, and I am at the same time fueled by the work that I know that we need to continue to infuse into our arts programming and evaluation, and thinking about social emotional learning and feeding the entire child through the arts in this work. And so my head spins and my heart breaks, and I'm motivated and I'm discouraged all at the same time.
And Ms. Roberts, if I just following up on that, I mean, I'm so struck by what you've said, because it, speaking personally, it feels to me that so often people don't see or refuse to see the humanity in Black and Brown people, right? And it just sort of leaves me with this internal question of, when do we get to just be? And I believe Ms. Mcchristian made a similar point just a moment ago. When do we get to just be, right? When can we be sort of viewed through the lens of our full humanity and not reduced to a single mistake, or being the perpetual outsider, the perpetually suspicious person, and also what that does to the soul, to be thrust into that place of being the perpetual outsider, the perpetually suspicious person. And I just throw that out there for reactions.
This is a, I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, please.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me to this distinguished panel. I just wanted to add my thoughts and echo what I've heard in regard to the joy and frustration. I was rejoicing, but then I was troubled by the fact that I had to rejoice, because it was the fact that we were, as a nation, sitting on the edge of our seats wondering what would be, is a testimony to how far we have to go. And if it wasn't for the individuals that were videotaping, and which I believe in turn forced the evidence in regard to the police cams to go public, we probably would not have seen a victory here. Because even with all of the eyewitnesses, the weight wound up being the visuals that we were getting from the recordings, which means that there is a lot of re-education, sensitization, retraining that has to be done with the police, with interactions with the community, and that's a continuing struggle. There is a frustration among Black and Brown people in regard to that struggle. And since I'm here representing the major part of my own background, what people don't realize is that Native people actually are killed by law enforcement at a higher rate than any other racial group in this country. And our stories are not told.
Can I, Dr. Norwood? Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, and just following up on that point, because what you said is so important and so powerful, because of how often Indigenous peoples are overlooked in this conversation. And could you say a little bit more about why you think that is, and what that does to Indigenous folks? I'm not asking you to represent, all the peoples of the.
I certainly can't speak for all Indigenous folks. And I pastor a multi-racial congregation. My family is both Indigenous and African American, and so I see the frustration from both sides. One of the things that I am keenly aware of is that the outcry from the Black community gets press coverage.
Yeah.
It may not get the coverage that it deserves. It may not get the coverage that is equivalent, but it makes the news. Whereas much of the suffering of American Indians doesn't. We got more coverage over the water protectors issue with the Dakota Access Pipeline than I had seen in much of my lifetime, unless we were protesting something, and burning something down. Our stories of anguish and pain just are not told. From 1999 to 2015, the mortality rate for Native Americans killed by law enforcement is 12% higher than that for African Americans and 3 times the rate of whites. And people don't know that. Our women go missing and their stories aren't told, and their situation isn't even adequately investigated often. So there is a lot to do. And I think that we need to share our stories. We need to be aware of what's going on, and we need to be open to hearing one another so that we can address these problems.
And just again, following up on that point, what are your thoughts about how we can move forward in terms of making known, educating people around the history that you're referring to, the present realities, the trauma and the violence that is inflicted on Indigenous communities?
Well, I think one of the things that has to be done is that Indigenous communities need to be acknowledged as still existing in many areas of the country. In New Jersey, there are textbooks that still teach, maybe about a paragraph to a page of Indigenous history in the state, and then acts like it ended back in the 1800s, when there are Indigenous communities in the state, 3 of which are recognized, have an official government-to-government relationship with the state. And there are many educators that don't know that still teach as though it's something of the past, and our people left and we were happy to leave and said, God bless you, and rode off into the sunset. So acknowledging one's existence is a pivotal point to beginning to work toward justice.
So Dr. White, can I turn back to you in this moment just to sort of talk to us about, and you've alluded to it already a little bit in terms of the significance of the history and understanding our present, and Dr. Norwood's alluding to this as well in his observations about, we have this long legacy of police violence in Indigenous communities. And then when we also have, deep structural racism, we've had that for, generations, centuries, with you think considering enslavement. Can you just talk to us a little bit about how the past connects to the present in your view, through the lens of this issue of policing, or just through the lens of racialized injustice generally?
Mm-hmm. That's a big question. It could, teach whole courses on it. Let me say this in terms of this particular moment that we're in. It's what I see is every single time Black people make some kind of progress towards being recognized as full human beings, and when our humanity is acknowledged, it somehow gets interpreted as, a gain for them means a loss for us. And we've seen that time and time again. And I think this particular period follows, let's understand, there was great joy with the election of Barack Obama. And even before that, you could look at, the late 1990s, the early 2000s, where there was this moment of Black optimism, serious Black, given Black incarceration, given, what became known as the quote unquote underclass, there was still a rising middle class. There was this whole phenomenon that we talked about as post-Black. And what that post-Black phenomenon was, it's like, oh my God, we can actually now breathe. We can actually represent other parts of our identity. You had a post-Black arts movement. You had all kinds of people like Touré. You had literary artists saying, we are just more than just our Blackness. We are gay. We are transsexuals. We are women. You had so many people coming out and saying, finally, even to the election of a Black president. You had Jesse Jackson crying at Grant Park. And it's almost like, all right, y'all got joy. You have joy You actually now are breathing and acting like you're real human beings. Let's stamp on it. Because somehow that got interpreted as our loss, a zero-sum game, as economists would call it. Their gain is our loss, and somehow we have to take it back. We have to make America great again. We have to go back to the 1950s. And the only thing that changed that, the only thing that gave birth to this moment of optimism that you could see in the early 2000s and with the election of Barack Obama. What gave birth to that? The civil rights movement, which morphed into the Black Power movement, pressure, confrontation. It's unfortunate that it is only when, we just can't get justice unless we have these extreme moments where somebody has to die in front of the world to say, okay, you see, we've been telling you the truth all along. You call it Black rage. You say Black women are angry. You're always talking about slavery. Don't talk about the past. It is only when we talk about the past. It is only when we keep our pedal to the metal, so to speak, when we organize, that we actually get progress. And that's what I'm hoping this is the beginning of, not, okay, the ending of. Because there is just so much work to do in every single sphere, every socioeconomic sphere.
If I could just comment on one thing that Dr. White just said. One of the things that struck me, and I just heard,
Dr. Norwood, I'm sorry, could you turn up your volume just a little? I'm having trouble hearing you. I don't know if other
I'm
people
sorry.
as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to turn up my
There
volume.
you go. Now I can hear you. I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, I'll speak up. I'll turn up my volume biologically. Okay. So one of the things that was just said is, how people critique Black and brown folks by talking about the past. And I think all people of color need to continue not only to study the past, but to proclaim and teach the past, because if we don't, we're condemned to repeat it. And one of the just most outrageous things that I heard in a previous election cycle many years ago was a vice presidential candidate critiquing Michelle Obama for making a comment about her being proud of her country because of the response and the reactions that were given to her husband, and that it was the first time she had a deep and abiding pride. And she was critiqued. And the critique was, well, I've always been proud of my country. That's that demonstrated a total misunderstanding of what Michelle Obama was communicating, a total misunderstanding of what she, her family, and everyone that looked like her had experienced for generations. And so, yes, we have to talk about the past because it informs us about the present. The sins of the past continue. They're continuing today. And they're going unnoticed, unrecognized, and people act as though you're attacking America or you don't love America if you point out its flaws. If you really love America, you want to correct its flaws. And that's something that we have to certainly be working together to do.
Elise, can I pick up on that?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
I was going to ask you next if you didn't.
Yeah. Because something that we're advocating for at the Institute for Social Justice is the creation of a New Jersey reparations task force. There's a bill currently now that will create a 2-year task force, A711, S322. And so when people hear that word reparations, to kind of the points that were made before, people think, what are we doing? Just making payouts? We've resolved that. We're in a post-racism America. We had a Black president elected. What more needs to be done? But I just want to share kind of 2 short stories that I think illustrate the point, especially right here in New Jersey. So currently, New Jersey has the highest white family median net wealth in the nation at $352,000. By comparison, the median net wealth for a Black family is only $6,100 and $7,300 for Latino families. So $352,000 compared to $6,100, $7,300. But how do we get here? This racial wealth gap, one of the starkest in the nation, didn't just appear overnight. Let's look at property, home ownership, which is one of the largest drivers of the racial wealth gap. When the colony of New Jersey was first founded, English settlers were allotted extra acres of land for every enslaved person they brought with them to the colony. After we were able to be freed, New Jersey had an early form of sharecropping called cottaging that took place very deeply here in New Jersey. Subsequently, racially restrictive covenants took hold within our state, redlining took hold. Soldiers, Black soldiers who were returning from World War II were denied access to the GI Bill. Predatory lending practices that took place during the Great Recession targeted Black communities, which has led to New Jersey consistently having the highest foreclosure rate in the nation. This is a history here that has led us to the racial wealth gap we see today that we need to understand, we need to research, and we need to create reparative policies and structures to remedy that harm. Very quickly, another story. In New Jersey, we had a school called the Bordentown School, founded in 1886 by the formerly enslaved Reverend Walter Rice. It was called the Tuskegee of the North because it was a state-run boarding school for New Jersey's Black students that was modeled on the Tuskegee Institute from Booker T. Washington. It was visited by such luminaries during its time as Albert Einstein, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Eleanor Roosevelt, and many others, and graduated generations of lawyers, educators, people in the health field, etc. After New Jersey ended school segregation and the school failed to integrate, only attracting 2 white students, it closed. And what do we think now sits on the land was once home to the most elite boarding school for Black students in the nation? Hayes, New Jersey's only girls' youth prison. And across the street sits JMSF, the state's most secure youth prison for boys. And today, New Jersey has the worst Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in the nation, where a Black child is 21 times more likely to be locked up than their white counterpart. So we have to trace the history. We have to understand how we got to these shameful racial disparities that are present here in the Garden State. And our first push is for a reparations task force. California became the first state to have one. We're pushing for New Jersey to become the second to study and make these recommendations. And so anyone who wants to join us, Saturday, Juneteenth at noon here in Newark by the Lincoln Memorial, we're having a Juneteenth reparations rally to push for this task force, which really needs to get done especially during this important election year here in New Jersey.
There is so much to say about everything that has been said, but before I do that, Ms. Roberts, can I ask you to talk about the role of arts with respect to history and all the things that have been discussed so far? That's a big question. That may not be fair, but
it's an excellent question. And it's what I've been thinking about as I've been hearing the stories and the narratives that are being brought forth, even on the panel today. Artists play the role of being the culture keepers. We do that through the oral history. We do that through the storytelling. We do that through the songs. And then thinking about the danger of a single story and thinking about the stories that we choose to produce, that we choose to fund, the story tellers that we choose to produce, we choose to fund throughout the state. That is also a way with which we are the artistic historians about the narratives that have shaped the state, where it is and where it's going to continue to go. Just like Dr. Norwood mentioned, we have to teach the history so as to not repeat it. We have to also in our arts make sure that we are being responsible in the research that goes into the stories, that we're not promoting revisionist history through the narratives, that we're not promoting cultural appropriation through the narratives that we choose to tell and that we choose to fund. And so as an arts administrator, I think about if I have teaching artists going into schools to tell the narratives of Indigenous people, why would I have a non-Indigenous person benefiting from racial capitalism of that narrative, right? If I'm a predominantly white arts institution and I'm sitting on stolen land and benefiting from cultural programming that's going into the communities and going into the schools, is that my place to do so? Or should that work be done in partnership with organizations or completely with organizations and arts organizations, artists who are indigenous to their own stories? So that we can avoid these pitfalls that play out in the history classrooms, in the historical narratives, in those textbooks, but also on our stages, in our museums, in our sculptures, in the physical murals that we paint on the walls, and in the streets that paint our cities. And so I think there's a great responsibility for us as artists and arts administrators, arts educators, to think about ourselves as historians. I'm really honored to be sitting amongst this group of people, and I don't, by any stretch of the imagination, put myself on the level of their expertise. And yet I, as an artist, know the power that I have to tell my agent, I'm actually not going to go audition for that piece because it is not reflective of an accurate narrative that I want to build or want to be a part of, want to bring into audiences. Because think about so many of the experiences that I have had as a young person growing up have been related to the songs that I learned in music classes that told me about history, about Christopher Columbus in 1492, all these little rhymes and these little stories, these little things that continue to perpetuate inaccuracies. And so that's on us. And so that is where I think us as artists, arts administrators, educators can start to take on the responsibility that the other folks on this panel have lifted up as historians, and making sure that the narratives that we're putting forth are accurate and are responsible and are bringing us towards all of the different themes of this conference, right? Of anti-racism, of justice.
I'd like to chime in and just, I've been privileged actually to head the Scarlet and Black Project at Rutgers University. And I guess one of the things that I can say and say confidently is that change can occur, but that it does come with pressure, and it does come only when people organize and when people insist. I mean, if you look at Rutgers University started. It was founded by slaveholders, not only just slaveholders, by slave traders. The people who built that school they got their money from the sale of Black bodies. It exists in New Brunswick. New Brunswick was a stop on the Underground Railroad, but a huge area where you had slave catchers. People would come through on their way to either New York or Canada, and and the biggest structure in the middle of New Brunswick was the jail, where they kept not only those the free Blacks, but also enslaved Blacks. Rutgers University did not admit its first student until after the Civil War, and that is it didn't graduate until 1892. And yet, when Obama comes to give his commencement address in 2016, he says, and I quote, that this is perhaps the most diverse college or university in the country. So how does Rutgers move from being a place where in 1967, really, there were a handful of Black people on all of the campuses? We're talking about Camden and Newark and Camden. The campuses there sit in the middle of Black communities, and yet it was a fortress. There was actually a fence around Newark to keep, I'm sure, to keep the white people in and the Black people out. And yet that doesn't happen today. And how did that happen? Our third volume of the Scarlet and Black series tells you how it happened. Basically, it happened from the ground up. Black students, and on all three campuses, organized. And these are Black students, most of whom are middle class or working class, whose parents sent them to get an education, and who didn't really want to risk their not getting their degree, for which they're whole families put so much pride in. But the fact is that they organized Black student unions on all student campuses. They took over buildings on all 3 campuses. They had demonstrations on all 3 campuses. They basically made sure that the faculty, that the administrators, that the Board of Governors, that they heard them, and they kept up the pressure. The first thing that the students in 1967 did when they got into the campus was like, I want more people who look like me. They set up Black studies departments. They set up Puerto Rican and Caribbean studies departments. It was really not, it was in the late 1960s to 1970 to 2016 that you saw the development, the diversification of that campus. And it happened because the students there pressured the university, the faculty pressured the university, New Jersey residents pressured the university. So a change can occur. And we have documented it with the Scarlet and Black Project. It can occur. Rutgers now has its first African-American president. It can occur, but it has to come, people have to organize, they have to stay vigilant, and they have to bring pressure.
Can I just and thank you all for that. Just, you know, there's so much here to process and to say, and I just want to I want to circle back to Dr. White's points in just a moment. But I also wanted to, before I do that, capture some of the larger themes that I'm hearing in this conversation, and to sort of get your reactions on one way that I'm processing this. So first of all, I mean, I was struck, Ms. Roberts, your point about, you know, this is not a single story. And I'm thinking of the Nigerian author, was it Chimamanda Adichie? I'm going to mess up her name, who talks about that, right? We are not a single story, right? We, as Dr. White was saying earlier, we have a history of excellence that goes unrecognized in this country. A history of thriving when we're allowed to thrive in this country. But we also have tremendous pain and tremendous trauma. And, you know, just so it strikes me that one of the challenges is that people sort of don't recognize the complexity of the different experiences of minoritized people, right? So we have this richness and this complexity, and part of progress, it seems to me, is to be understood through the lens of that complexity rather than to be reduced to a single story. And it's, you know, one of the, I think, I'm going to say something that may be a little bit provocative, but sometimes I feel like America is addicted to the pain of people of color, right? So that we only see people through the lens of pain, and even, you know, folks who want to, you know, to change harsh and abusive and dangerous, murderous policing practices. There's even for folks who are, you know, the most well-meaning, there is also this sense of like, when is it ever going to be enough for you, you know, you people? Like, when, you know, when can we, you know, when can we stop? And it just sort of strikes me, even going back to Ms. Mcchristian's point, that, you know, the larger question is also, when do we get to thrive, right? When do we not only get to survive, but when do we get to thrive? And how do we realize those conditions? So going back to the points that Dr. Gray White was making around, you know, how do we change, and where does change come from? So I've just put a lot out there, but just curious for your reactions, because the title of this event is Creating Change. So part of the question here is, how do we create change, and then what are we changing? And so one of the point that I've just introduced is, you know, can we sort of, I don't know, we have structural issues in this country, structural racism. We also have sort of this very thin way of understanding the humanity of minoritized peoples. So I'm going to stop there and then just get your reactions and see what you think.
Well, one of the things that I have had to confront is the concept that just because I may point out an issue, point out a problem, want to lift up corrections and provide accurate history, does not mean I hate America. You know, I'm a veteran. My people have served in the military of this country at a higher rate than any other racial group in the nation throughout the history of the country, per capita. You come to American Indian events and the American flag is waved high. It's, you know, so just because we want change and justice does not make us anti-American. And so making that a part of the story would cause many who would be our allies but are being convinced by our opponents that we just want to destroy the country is something that is a message that we need to own and begin to make sure people understand. The other thing is that I'm not just fighting for people of color. This isn't just about people of color. This is ultimately about making our nation better. It is ultimately about healing all people. It is ultimately about making everyone understand where the cracks are, where the foundational problems may be, that we can work together towards some of those things. And so I think that that's another aspect. It's not me versus you, us versus them. That was the theme of the last political administration. It's us together trying to make things better. And that I need to listen to you just as much as you listen to me, so that we can find some middle ground, some areas we can agree upon. You know, we all want our children to thrive and live in a safe community and have opportunity.
I would add, Professor Body, as you were talking about, when do we not just survive, but we can thrive? It makes me think about Dr. Bettina Love, who's the author of We Want to Do More Than Survive, and wrote the hip hop curriculum, and now is the founder of the Abolitionist Teaching Network. And one thing that Dr. Love said that resonated with me so much when I was in the middle of working on anti-racism programming initiative through the arts with young audiences in New Jersey, was that we're not just showcasing Black trauma and Black pain. So much of the resistance is Black joy. And so that should be hugely a part of the narrative, and uplifting Black joy and excellence in celebration in the work that we do too. And that's part of the resistance. But I think that's a part of the narrative that we forget about, right? That if I'm on stage singing an aria and showcasing and dancing and using my full body to tell narratives of love and joy, that's important too. And that's important for all people to see.
And I can just hop in here, and Elisa, I was just like trying to think of how I can respond in a very cogent way. I think too often when people think, oh, you've had enough, you want more, people get stuck on this idea of performative justice. So it's been almost a year next month since George Floyd was murdered. Here in New Jersey, since that time, we've had Juneteenth made a state holiday. We've had the county freeholder title changed. We have not had passage of a meaningful policing reform bill here in the state. We've been advocating for the passage of the CCRB bill to create municipal civilian complaint review boards. We just had it voted out of committee with over 60 people testifying in support. It has not moved from out of committee to a floor vote. We have had a call for an end to qualified immunity, as other states are starting to do. We cannot move that bill, which has been introduced through the legislature. After George Floyd was murdered, as a low-hanging fruit, the New Jersey legislature introduced a chokehold ban bill. That bill has languished in the legislature, even as other states very easily are picking up that mantle. So we can't even get to the conversation about how do we move beyond policing to make mental health first responders. Because as we saw last year when Maurice Gordon was killed on the State Parkway and had mental health concerns, how could that have been addressed by someone trained in mental health response? We can't even move to restorative justice practices. How do we have healing circles rather than police interaction? How do we have youth diversionary options that never implicate law enforcement officers? How do we meaningfully reinvest funding back into our schools, our communities, our resource centers, our housing, so that police aren't involved within those processes? So the fact that we've been given great things in a performative way while not being able to move things that would actually hold accountable police and would hold accountable resources into the communities for public safety options shows that it's not going to be enough until we start focusing on equity rather than just equality in name or performance alone.
And that's so powerfully said. I mean, so this, and I want to circle back to that. I'm going to try to put together that point and the points that have been made by Dr. Gray-White and Dr. Norwood as well. So, how do we make change real rather than performative? And I was sort of struck by the point that Dr. Gray-White made earlier about sort of, so Rutgers, Black and brown people being admitted to Rutgers, but sort of how do we move the conversation maybe in that historical moment and continuing to this day past, okay, sort of we can celebrate the fact that we have more diversity within Rutgers, but then we have the question of, well, what are the terms of the educational environment, right? Not only do we can't just sort of give up and say, well, we're here and that's it, let's celebrate. We also, do we have equity in the curriculum? How are we being treated in the classrooms? The terms of education matter. That's sort of in parallel with what you're saying, Ms. Mcchristian. It's like, we don't want just the performative, we want the real change, and then Dr. Norwood's point about how people perceive efforts to make institutions better and fair as destroying the institutions just because we're critical of the institution. When you're critical of the institution, that means that you're taking time to try to figure out how to make it better. That is an act of institutional belonging. That's an act of love for the institution and the people within the institution. If you're using that energy to try to make it better. And so I guess, going back to sort of the question that I tried to pose, and we've talked about it in the policing context, but what else are we changing? And how do we get there, right? Do we have a menu? Do we have an agenda? And maybe even, Ms. Mcchristian, going back to your point about reparations, is reparations the lens through which we need to have this conversation?
Sure. Well, thanks for that question, Elise, because the Institute actually does have an agenda. It's called the Black in New Jersey 2021 through 2022 Action Agenda to make Black lives really matter in New Jersey. And so I dropped the link to that in the chat because, to your point, we have a lot to address here in a state that's really listed by many as a bastion of progressive nature. We have the highest ratio of Black to white infant mortality death in the nation, over 2 to 1 in terms of Black to white likelihood of COVID-19 hospitalization. As I said, we have the highest Black to white disparity rate in both our youth incarceration and adult incarceration facilities. We have the 6th most segregated state in the nation for Black students, which I know you're very familiar with, Professor Body, and very stark racial wealth gap numbers. And so in our action agenda, we've laid out a number of different ways that everyone can kind of take this document and do policy and advocacy wherever you are, whether it's by closing the racial wealth gap, by advocating for things like baby bonds, guaranteed income, canceling student loan debt, transforming the youth justice system, supporting some of the bills we currently have out there, such as restorative justice bill that would create restorative justice hubs for young people so they never become system involved, keeping communities safe, getting involved with reform processes like the Newark consent decree process, which we're involved in, or looking to community-based investments, ensuring democracy for all. Something that we've successfully advocated for was 83,000 people in New Jersey having their right to vote restored on probation and parole. Next step is making sure incarcerated people can vote as well, so that right to vote is never taken away. And then lastly, repairing the harm of racism, which is kind of all wound together in the reparations task force bill I talked about before. And so we wanted to create a tool that everyone could use wherever you are, whatever path or level you are in your social justice advocacy, because this is an election year in New Jersey. Every single seat in the legislature is up, as well as the governor's seat. And people who we vote into office need to be accountable to the communities they represent. That's the bottom line. And so we hope that you'll be able to take this tool and use it to advocate from wherever you are right now.
Forgot to unmute myself. So thank you so much for that, Ms. Mcchristian. I should have disclosed that I'm on the board of the New Jersey Institute. So, you know, maybe that was unfair, but to tee you up like that. But so we have a few minutes before Q&A, and I want to encourage members of the audience, if you have questions for the panel or specific panelists, to please post them under the Q&A prompt. Just sort of before we move to Q&A, though, could we talk a little bit more concretely about how to bring about change, and what are some of the tools? And Ms. Roberts, maybe I can start with you and then move to Dr. Norwood and then Dr. Gray-White.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. From an arts education standpoint, I think about Vanguard Theater Company, which is in Montclair, New Jersey. And they are reimagining and revisioning stories with young people from diverse communities across the state through the mission of DREAM, which stands for diversity, reciprocity, education, activism, and mentorship. And they're taking these old chestnut stories that are problematic, and they're also empowering students to write through devised theater their own new stories, and they're reimagining them. And they're having these conversations through the arts, through the rehearsal process, through mentorship with professionals and representation on a professional level for these students about what the stories are that they're telling with these kids. And so when they have casts that are telling stories that historically have been completely whitewashed and white from the creative team behind the scenes and on stage, and now have casts that are 60% people of the global majority, and that's backstage and on stage, and the students are coming from these really segregated school districts where they might be in an all Black community all the time or an all white community all the time. And this show, this one artistic experience, is the first time that these students are coming together in community to reframe these narratives. It's really, really powerful. So I think about the community-based model for arts programming, and I also think about social justice standards in terms of how we evaluate the arts. As a performer, there's a march on Broadway happening in New York right now, and the demands are really clear. They're rallying for accountability, safe work environments for people of the global majority, transparency in our unions, inclusion for trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming actors, disabled communities. And I think that as an artist, we need to really be holding ourselves, our theaters, accountable about making sure that they really are creating these safe work environments before we go back to work. And I think that we need to own our power as artists, because if we are not going back to work and that we are unified in that, we will be putting the pressure on, as Dr. White said, to our arts organizations to make sure that they are progressing and making the work environment safe for us to come back.
Can I just make a comment and then ask you to respond? Because, you know, it sort of strikes me that when you're trying to create change, you know, we have this sort of head-heart issue. So often, you know, when we try to, and I put myself in this category as a lawyer, you know, when we want to make change, we give them the facts. You know, we say these are the facts, and you know, and this is wrong. And obviously, we need lawyers. I am an advocacy for change through law, but it just strikes me that there's so much power in the arts because the art speaks to the soul, right? And so, you know, it's one thing to say to somebody, this is a problem, these are the harms, but then when you see a performance, when you hear music, when you see a painting, when you read a book, that sort of speaks to people in a different way. And can you just sort of talk, I don't know, react or offer your thoughts about that?
Sure. I mean, I think facts are important. I think that people are going to respond differently. I think that white supremacy culture tells us that worship of the written word is something that people are going to respond to. So those numbers, those statistics are important. But I think that the arts offer a multimodal approach where we can have conversation that isn't verbal. So if there is a painting that your heart is responding to, if there is a song that you are expressing emotion through, if there is a monologue or a piece of poetry with which we're allowed to explore social emotional learning in young people, or even as adults, we're still in communication, we're still building community, but we're doing it through a multimodal lens. And so I think the head, the heart is important. I think policy is important so that when the individuals are not in place, right, we are still being held accountable. And I think that it's to use a theater term, it's a yes and, right? We need all of these different approaches to continue to move the needle forward. And so that's why I think that's why all of these approaches are used and integrated. Oh, and I think you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I should know better. We have a few questions, but which we'll turn to, but Dr. Norwood and Dr. Gray-White, any other thoughts before we jump to Q&A?
Well, I have a couple of, well, gosh, I have so many thoughts and comments, but, you know, Rutgers just recently established a Center for Global Justice. It's there's a much longer title, but one of the things that we're hoping, I mean, we started with the Scarlet and Black Project, and that came from students. Students said, you know, we don't feel like we really belong. 2015, we don't really feel like we belong. We have our 250th celebration, centennial or whatever, 250th anniversary of the founding of Rutgers, and we still don't feel like we really belong here. So we've got 3 volumes of history now. So what are we doing with it? All right, we have asked for, you know, scholarships for our students, but what we hope to do with this Center for Global Justice is to bring about some kind of change, to pair with the educational, with the schools in the New Brunswick and the Camden and the Newark area, and somehow use all of the resources for Rutgers in the educational system. I mean, that, it seems to me, is what a state university ought to be doing. We now have, Rutgers is now paired with Robert Wood Johnson. We have this huge health facility and Black health. There seems to be so many ways that that Rutgers can contribute to, well, to global racial justice. And through this institute is what, which really came out of so much. It came out of the new president that we have. It also came out of the Scarlet and Black Project. But this is what we're aiming at, not just to have the history for history's sake, just so we can go back and find, actually, I do have something that I'd like to hold up so that we have a volume that shows, where Black people, what Black people have done, the history of Black people at Rutgers, but we want to use it for something. And with this new center, hopefully, I did the history, and now I'm handing it over to the policymakers and handing it over to other educators so that they can use it to bring about change.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. And as someone who is the Newark director for the Institute, I appreciate that recommendation and observation. So I'm going to just, there are a couple of particular questions I'm going to group together. And then, one I'm going to direct specifically to Lindsey, Ms. Roberts, which is, everything that the panelists have said is so powerful. However, do any of you have advice for small arts organizations that are trying to make the important changes but are struggling to even survive? What small changes can we start with to ultimately make the big and fundamental changes that need to happen? And the person who's asking this question is part of a small visual arts center in New Jersey, where we are both a gallery and offer art classes. And I'll ask Ms. Roberts to respond to that one. And then the second one, which I'll just throw open to everyone, is, do you think a conversation needs to be included in the force of change to address the white supremacy issues resurging and emanating all over America? So we have about 8 minutes left, and there's some other questions I see in the chat, but
Sure. So I think to break down the systems, you can start by looking at your strategy. And if you have a strategic plan, what does that look like in every area of operation of your organization? So programming, where are you upholding white saviorhood? Where are you upholding cultural appropriation through the work that you present? Who's holding power in the decision-making and the access to the work that you are producing or presenting? In finance, are you practicing wage transparency? Are there financial disparities between positions, between different identifying groups? If you think about technology, especially in a virtual space, where are there gaps in access to the programming that you are providing? What does your marketing say about who's included and invited to the party, to hearken to Donna Walker Kuhn's book, Invitation to the Party? Who's invited to the party and who's not, through the marketing and the way that you talk about the programming? Are you doing a community-based model of the work? Have you actually asked the people in the community that you serve what they're interested in doing? Have you brought them in? Are they sitting in on your board? What's the demographic breakdown of your staff, of your audience, of your board members? So I think you can really look strategically through every item on your strategic plan or every area of operation in your organization. And there's a lot of tools out there that are already outlining those steps on how to start to make some important changes, like immediately today.
Can I just ask for definitional purposes for people who may not have understood? So can you just explain what you mean by white saviorhood?
Yes, I can. So I have found oftentimes in predominantly white organizations, there is an idea that we are coming in to help the Black and Brown, the marginalized communities, especially with young people. And we're not speaking to the impact of the work that we're doing, but we're really speaking to trying to save a community through the art, to, we'll say, serve them. We'll use deficit-based language like underserved, underprivileged, yeah, I guess trying to save those communities through the work that we're doing is the best way that I could describe that without using specific examples.
And Elise, I just want to add on to the question about from the Small Visual Arts Center, because, as kind of what we were talking about before, that Ms. Roberts and Professor Abadi, you were talking about, is that, lawyers, we can give you the stats, we can give you the facts, and you may be swayed, you may not. And you need those stories, those human stories to connect, because people are going to identify themselves in what they're seeing. For example, we were able to, as I mentioned, successfully restore the right to vote to 83,000 people on probation and parole. Yes, legislative advocacy, our stats, our numbers was a great part of that. We were also able to work with a documentarian who profiled my colleague Ron, who had been incarcerated for over 30 years, and through this law was able to have his right to vote restored. And so there's a documentary called Voter, I encourage you all to see it, that traces Ron's personal story through his advocacy in this campaign. And that was crucial because people saw that documentary and said, oh, I get it now. That could be my brother, that could be my friend, that could be me. In addition, with our youth council work, we've been able to work, have our youth council create photography, create videos, do drawings and paintings about their own experiences being within the system and how it made them feel. And those land in a way that just listing the stats might not necessarily do so. So I encourage that small center and anyone else who's thinking, how do I get involved in this? Think of how the issue could best be conveyed to move the greatest amount of people. And that's a wonderful place to start.
Thank you so much for that. And I have a message that we can go over by 5 minutes if we need to. So Dr. Norwood or Dr. Gray-White, any or anyone else takers on the white supremacy question? Do we need to have conversations about white supremacy? I think that was the gist of the question.
One of the things that I think people need to understand is that what we have seen that seems to be shocking to many in the country, because people have been emboldened, and we've seen the realities of January 6th and the attack of the Capitol and the mixing of pro-racist groups in that movement. People are shocked, but I wasn't, and I don't think anybody on this panel was necessarily surprised that this is still in the country. We've been experiencing it all along. The difference is that, as you say, that there's a new boldness about it. There's a new permission to be as rude as possible and as closed-minded as possible. One of the things, though, that I try to advocate is that as we see that and we're disgusted by it, we need to make sure that we're not participating in it, and that we rise above and do what we can to advocate without simply being reactionary. And so that's something that I try to do as much as I can, and I pray that everyone else does also.
Speaking to white supremacy, I think there's a desperation. There is a desperation right now, because my sense is that we have to keep up the pressure, but white supremacy pays dividends. Let's face it. For those who are the beneficiaries of that privilege, one historian has said, he's called it the wages of whiteness. You could cash in on it. And I think there's a desperation in the sense that, okay, we're not making as much, we're not, and particularly with predictions that the majority population in America is going to be brown. There's a fear and there's a desperation. And in some ways that should give us hope, because, for those people who have figured out, for those white Americans who have figured out that, all right, well, maybe I don't need that dividend of whiteness. Maybe I can do without my privilege. I actually have to make it some other way. But there is a huge percentage of people in this country who have counted on and have cashed in generation after generation on white supremacy, because it pays them, if nothing but a psychological wage. The fact of knowing that somehow I am a step above because my skin is white. And so it means something. And I think that when it gets to that level, we really, really need to really understand that this is a fight to the death. It's a terrible way to put it, but this is not going, it's not people are going to see the terrible, or the wisdom of what we're speaking. We are going to have to fight for it. We are really going to have to fight. We are going to have to demonstrate, that we're going to have to get rid of that white privilege. And that is not going to be an easy thing to do. That is not, because there is a particular desperation now. There's a meanness about it that used to be, trust me, this is not the first time, but it went underground, and now it is reappearing in a very ugly, but also very desperate. I think January 6th, we saw desperation.
Can I, in that we only have 5 minutes left. I'm just wondering if any of you have thoughts about how people can be an ally, or as some of us say, an accomplice in this work, because it does, and before we run out of time, I also want to make sure that I, thank you all for participating in this panel and sharing all of these very powerful observations, because it does involve emotional labor. I think that's something that people don't quite realize, to sort of to have these conversations is it can be very taxing and draining. So thank you for that. But then just and the question of how can people who want to help be an effective ally?
If I could address that, one of the things that we've experienced are many from various backgrounds wanting to assist and aid Indigenous people in their causes and to learn more about our cultures. And that's very welcome. That's very welcome. One of the things, though, that I found is that we have to remind everyone that being an ally doesn't mean that you're in charge. Being an ally means that you come alongside, that you support, that you learn what the priorities are of the community you want to assist, and then you provide whatever resources that will help in them gaining those goals and objectives. That's very important to remember. That's very important to remember. That's something that I've seen done well, and it's sometimes not so well. The other thing is that people of color need to understand that we do have allies. We have people of good conscience and of goodwill from other communities that want to interact, want to assist, and we have to be willing to do the same thing. With the recent attacks against Asian Americans, it's very important that all people of every community rally around our Asian brothers and sisters and make that a priority also, that we're not just so into our challenges and our progress that we forget the struggles of others.
Thank you so much for that. That's very powerful. Any other closing thoughts on that point?
I mean, I guess I'll just add, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you were talking about emotional labor release, because there's nothing more frustrating than me when someone has come to me and said, hey, I want to learn about this issue. I want to learn about policing. I want to learn about reparations. I share the resources. Here's the best explanation I have. Here's all the readings you can do. And then a week later, they come back and I say, well, did you read what I gave you? Oh, well, I was going to that's emotional labor for people who are already consistently dealing with an onslaught of oppression. And so I think I am always happy to speak to someone who has tried their best to figure it out and then comes with questions, informed questions. Hey, I read this. I was wondering about this. I saw this and I wasn't sure. I am more than happy to have that conversation. But if you're not willing to educate yourself, ask what resources and actually follow up and review the resources, it's just adding more to people who are already kind of doing their best just to be happy and have that joy. So I think just educating yourself is probably the biggest thing I can think of, and asking educated questions.
I would add that people who are looking for that kind of assistance should not expect to be comfortable, and should not expect that the people who are doing this kind of emotional work are going to make them comfortable, because that, quite frankly, is what I find a lot of people who want to help or say they want to help. I want to know more. In essence, they want to be more comfortable. They want to be more comfortable in their own skin, and they want us, or people like us who are really involved, they want us to make them comfortable. And that is really not our role in this.
Thank you all for that. We have run out of time, but I just want to, give my own applause, virtual applause for this wonderful panel and for your time and your energy and your insights. It's really been terrific for me, and I can see from the chat that the audience has really enjoyed it as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Donna Walker-Kuhn, who is going to talk about what's on for tomorrow.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, panel. This was such an important discussion. I think that understanding our history just aligned perfectly with the theme for today, which was speaking our truth. And so I really appreciate your insight and the passion for all of our panelists. Thank you very, very much. And I also want to thank Sharon Shoye for her racial healing circles, because I believe there we were also able to speak our truth because of the safe space that Sharon and her team created. So tomorrow, what to expect? Well, first, I'd like to ask everyone to please put one word or phrase that you're going to take with you from today into your work tomorrow and beyond. You know, one word or phrase that you're going to take with you from today's experience into your work in the future. Can everyone take a moment to do that? Woohoo. Oh, I love these. Strategic plan, power, action, change the narrative, planning, perspective, uncomfortable, empathy, listening, changes forth. Yes. Self-examination, intentional, include and honor, humanity, equity over equality, educate myself first, narrative change, mobilization, don't ask, white saviorhood, equality, intentional history. Wow, multi-voices, fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so tomorrow, we of course hope that all of you can join us tomorrow. We will have an amazing keynote address from Vu Le. I know today's keynote by Nicole just, we were all ready to pass out. It was just so powerful. Tomorrow, we're going to have another dynamic keynote address from Vu Le. So I hope you'll be able to be here for that. And then we have 9 different breakout sessions. So yes, you're going to have to make a choice, but each of them will offer something very unique and special, some of them towards healing, some are for specific tools, but everything is geared to our theme of creating change. And then tomorrow, and so that will be, you know, the sessions for tomorrow. And then later this afternoon, the New Jersey Arts and Cultural Administrators of Color will have their Power Hour. And that's today from 4 to 5. And that's a networking opportunity for our BIPOC attendees. So the BIPOC attendees are more than welcome to attend this specific networking hour. But for all of you, I hope you will continue to reflect, think about the changes that we can make. And thank you so much for your participation and your interest in changing the dynamics of New Jersey arts culture. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and we will see you tomorrow. Thank you. Good night.
We're still. We can leave now?